Hello and welcome to this video tutorial. My name is Ron Vellon, and in this video we're going to take a look at how to do a negotiation analysis, so what we refer to as a post-negotiation analysis for the negotiation course. This is a less time-consuming process than it is to do a negotiation plan. But it is a critical part of the process because this is where we distill and consolidate our learning from the negotiation we just completed, and is a really useful tool for the real world, not just for this course. So what I'm going to do is walk you through the 5 main questions using the template that you're expected to use, and then show you what an A-level analysis looks like from a previous student. So let's begin. Of course, we begin with the usual information: name, your ID, section number, all of this. Then we move on to make sure that we put in our opponent. And this is really the name of the student opponent. We know the role that's the opponent in the case that we're working on. And be sure you put in your role here. So we want the actual name of the student in the opponent section. So looking down, the first question, part A, or the first half of the first question, is asking what the results were. So what is the agreement you have reached, including the terms of the settlement? And you put it in here in bullets. And you'll see in the example how easy it is to put this in here, plus a brief explanation if needed. Anything you want to add that clarifies the deal, but do not put the bullet points of the actual terms of the agreement into long paragraphs. There's plenty of other space in the analysis to really go deep into what the deal was, how you got there, and any other learning. Give us the agreement. Don't give us backstory or rationales or all that stuff. Just clarify the deal and then move to the next question. And the next question is also pretty straightforward, and that is, how does the final settlement affect the state of the relationship with your opponent classmate? So this is the actual opponent you have in real life. In other words, who was the person you were negotiating with, and how did the relationship get impacted by the negotiation, either favorably or perhaps unfavorably, in 2 to 3 sentences. So this is basically a simple paragraph, and think about what happened as you negotiated. How do you think the different interactions you had over the time that you had for the negotiation impacted the person you actually negotiated with? Did it improve it? Were you friends with them and perhaps the negotiation impacted your friendship negatively? Whatever it is. Next question, we're going to move this up a little bit. This question is one of the 3 most valuable from a mark point of view. And so here we're asking, to what degree were your primary strategy and tactics successful? So in your plan, you're going to have your primary strategy and your 2 primary tactics. And you're going to answer this question, first of all, to what degree were they successful? Almost all negotiations, you're going to have some variation. So if it worked perfectly, that's going to be rare. Most of the time, it's not going to be 100%. So we want you to comment on that. We want you to explain why or why not. And to clarify, please read this paragraph in blue here, very important. Make sure you clearly state up front whether they were successful or not, then articulate what your original strategy and plan tactics were. Then explain what occurred. So you want to say to what degree your primary strategy and tactics were successful. Don't explain it yet. Then articulate what your original strategy and plan tactics were. So this is your primary strategy and tactics. Then you explain what occurred. And here my recommendation is, for a really good analysis, is something like 2 to 3 good paragraphs here. And again, when you're writing paragraphs, make sure you have 1 line space in between so it's readable. And in the example, you'll see what this looks like. This is a critical section because what you want to be doing is focusing all of your conversation in this 2 to 3 paragraphs around your strategy and primary tactics. Don't just start telling a once upon a time story about the negotiation and all that. This is a report, so you want to zoom in on the focal points of what you need to say in relation to your primary strategy and tactics. Very unlikely they'll work perfectly. So write about what happened. Make sure you relate it back to the strategy and tactics, your primary strategy and tactics, and you'll be good to go. Next question. How did your strategy and tactics change? So this is your primary strategy and tactics that we just talked about in the previous question. So how did your primary strategy or tactics change or shift or evolve during the negotiation process? Please explain. Did you use your backup strategy and or backup tactics, or one of them? Why and how? And you have to explain that. So once again, this is probably 2 to 3 paragraphs. Well written. Make sure you proofread your work so it makes sense. We're not looking for perfect grammar. We're looking for clarity and a professionally written document here. So do your best to make sure it's clear and you're not repeating yourself. But those two sections go together. You're going to see how things flow together. So that's the first page. Actually, that's the first page of the template. This will probably be, when you write it out, these 3 questions will take about 1.5 pages, more or less. You know, if it takes more, that's fine, but don't go over 2 pages for these 3 questions. Now let's take a look at questions 4 and 5 on the next page. This section here, question 4, is the most valuable in terms of the assignment question and maybe the most important question of the analysis. This question is broken down into 4 parts. You can think of them as A, B, C, and D. And what this question is designed to do is to give you a chance to reflect on the process you went through from start to finish around 4 specific things that we're looking at, so that you understand how you function throughout the negotiation and see where you were feeling strong and happy and feeling that you might be successful, and other times when you might have felt less confident, less able, maybe you were feeling frustrated or even angry at times or whatever. This gives you a chance to reflect on that and see how things kind of glue together. So if we look at the first question, why did you achieve the settlement that you did? This is not a question that's asking you, why did you want the outcome? Well, I wanted the outcome because the case said I wanted the outcome, or I wanted it because I wanted that new thing, or whatever it was. That's not what this question is asking. It's asking about the behaviors and actions that got you there. So that's why we're highlighting here behaviors and actions. And you want to explain those. This is probably going to be about 2 strong paragraphs. Remember, please, 1-line space between. In the example I'm going to show you in a moment, it will give you a sense of what's expected here. Next question, what was it that you were experiencing? And this is when we get into feelings and thoughts. What were you thinking about, feeling, concerned about, and so on at key times? At key times, that's really up to you to think about when that was important. But usually we look at things when they were most significant and see, when I was really feeling stuck, what was I feeling? What was I thinking? We have to be careful about using broad terms that I felt confident or I felt less confident or something like that. We really want to get into the specifics. So were you feeling frustrated, afraid, concerned, happy, excited, angry, aggressive, timid? Whatever it was, get into that at specific times that you think are important to talk about. The next question is, what were the 3 key turning points in what you were doing that led to this result? Every negotiation has a turning point, and it may be more obvious at times than others. But here we really want to be looking for those 3 moments when things shifted in the negotiation. Maybe you were feeling stuck with your partner, your opponent, and somebody did something different, or you did something different that shifted it. Or maybe the 2 of you just agreed that we were both stuck and maybe there was a different way to go about this. Maybe there was a time where you thought you wouldn't get to an agreement and suddenly you did something or your opponent did something and that shifted things and you got to an agreement when you didn't think you might. Whatever it was, we're looking for these key turning points. The second and third questions here, B and C, may or may not be connected. So here, what was it you were experiencing, thinking about, and so on? Again, we're looking for 2 to 3 paragraphs that may or may not coincide with the next question. I've had students sometimes tell me they prefer to answer the third question than the second one, but it may not be those times when you're feeling most intense. Sometimes things shift and your turning point is actually very easeful. So for this question C, we're looking for 3 paragraphs, each turning point in its own paragraph. Again, 1 line space between for everything, and that's for this too. And then the last question, what patterns of behavior did you notice that occurred between you and your opponent? These are not individual patterns. In other words, it's not you alone. These are patterns between you and your opponent together. So were you both kind of digging your heels and one of you was highballing, one of you was lowballing? If it was a more distributive negotiation, were both of you trying so hard to understand each other's interests that you kind of got lost and forgot to really close the deal, or whatever was going on? So these are patterns with your opponent. And make sure, please, you don't list a bunch of things that are not connected. So don't do that. And this will probably be, again, 2 to 3 paragraphs, depending on how long they are. And the usual line spacing in between each paragraph so I can read it. And that's this section. So this part, this question here, will probably be about a page of your analysis. Just this question 4. If it's more than that, be careful that you're not repeating yourself. So I'm going to say this here because this sometimes happens. Avoid repetition. There will be overlap between questions and maybe a little bit between paragraphs, but make sure you're not really saying everything completely over and over again. These questions are asking different things. And then we come to the last question. And this one is all about what will you do to improve. So this is simply a conversation you're having that identifies where are my improvements going forward. So the question is, what will you do differently or more of in your next negotiation? And this is any negotiation, not this particular negotiation, any negotiation. There's always room for improvement. Make sure you're focusing on specific behavior. And what we mean by this are actual actions you are going to try to do differently. So it's not enough to say, well, I'm going to plan better or read the case better. That's just bogus. You really want to focus on 3 specific behaviors or actions you want to do differently or better, each one in its own paragraph. So each one is separated here. You can see, obviously, the box, the table, each one here. So 1, 1, and 1. And this is one strong paragraph each. 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here. Let's examine now what an A-level analysis looks like. We begin by looking at the top. You see it's completed properly. We've X'd out all the data here because of confidentiality, but basically, person's name, their role, their opponent's name. Of course, this is their classmate's name, not the role in the case, ID, section number, and all that. We keep everything intact like we do with the plan. As was mentioned in the previous part of this video, of course, we keep the questions intact. We don't delete these. We keep the marking grids, all that kind of stuff. And we see here, if we look at the first question, what were the results, right? The terms of the final settlement. In this particular case, there were 3 main elements. So we're looking at 1-day trips each time. So that just describes for the case a cruise line that's visiting a particular island. So each trip is 1-day visit. 600 passengers disembark onto the island each day. And there's 6 trips like this per year. Ideally, a bit more explanation here. This person did a really good job with their analysis, but it's not perfect. I mean, there are little things you can correct, but this is A level. You'll see with the rest of it how thorough it is. But basically here, we want to make sure each of these needs to be crystal clear. Don't put anything else here. There's so many other spaces available to go on about context and actions you took and all that stuff. Just put down the deal here. And here, this person put a brief explanation to clarify a couple of things at the bottom, and you can do that as well. Moving to the second part of this question, so the one that asks about the relationship. The question asks, how does the final settlement affect the state of the relationship with your opponent classmate? So again, we're talking about your classmate, the person you're negotiating with. Explain in 2 to 3 sentences. And here what this person wrote was, this was the first time that I worked and interacted with Sam since the beginning of the course, and was a good surprise. He was prepared for the negotiation, aware of the details of the case, and conducted the negotiation with respect and attention. Our negotiation was peaceful and respectful, and in the end, we both were satisfied with the agreement. So I believe that the negotiation had a positive impact on our relationship. That's really what we're getting into here. Don't copy this. You have to come up with your own language. So don't use vague and general language here. Be specific to your experience in the exact case. Let's move on now to question 2. To what degree were your primary strategy and tactics successful? Why or why not? Again, it's important to read this blue part here that clarifies things. Make sure you clearly state up front whether they were successful or not. Then articulate what your original strategy and planned tactics were. Then explain what occurred. And by planned, again, we're talking about your primary strategy and tactics. And since no plan works perfectly, what we're looking for here is your description of how they unfolded. Here, right up front, he says, no, my primary strategy and tactics were not successful as I expected. You notice there's some grammar hiccups here. We want you to do your best, and you want to make sure you proofread your work, but if it's not perfect, don't worry about it. Just do your best to make it as clear as possible. Then he goes on to say in the first main paragraph, at the beginning of the negotiation, after sharing our opening offers, we realized that our point of views were different and contradicting. For my first strategy, and now he's saying it in the first paragraph, I suggested that we create a common goal. Now this is one of the strategies for integrative negotiation, in order to come up with an agreement that would be beneficial for both parties, even though it would be different from our target points. The first tactic that I used is finding a bridge solution. With this tactic, we tried to be transparent with all of the factors influencing our decision-making, including our issues and interests. This was not effective because my opponent had doubts about how our deal will affect his interests. One of his biggest concerns was the number of passengers that would disembark on the island, and he was thinking that any number more than 300 is unacceptable. I tried to counteroffer, and then he goes on to explain what he did, but he brings it back to the tactic. So far, he's saying that his common goal strategy seems to be on track, but there's a hiccup with the first tactic. And the finding a bridge solution, there's a technical element here about whether a bridge solution would have been the right tactic here. Typically, it isn't for this, but that's not the purpose of showing you this. So this description is pretty good about getting into how the tactic unfolded. So when you're writing this, don't just speak in generalities or go off on a long story. Bring it back to the tactic. So you should be talking about your strategy, first tactic, second tactic. That's how this section should be structured. Let's look now at the next page, because this goes over to the next page in the response. We'll bring this up. And he continues with the rest of the description of what he was saying. Then he says in this paragraph, unfortunately, even though we have had a lot of good discussions, I still had to move on to my second tactic because we were still unable to reach a deal for a number of passengers per day. So he's saying it worked for a while, it got us someplace, but we had to make a shift, or I had to make a shift. And using my second tactic, which is expanding the pie, another tactic for integrative negotiation, we went back to our respective cases to find more resources that would help us reach an agreement. So they both ended up engaging in expanding the pie, which he started using as a tactic, brought his opponent in on the dialogue, and they were able to find more things to kind of build into the potential agreement. And he goes on to explain that. And then he has a little summary at the end. So that's question 2. Gives you a sense of its importance. It's worth 20 points out of 100. And he does a great job in 3 solid paragraphs here of explaining what's going on. Let's move on to question 3. How did your strategy and tactics change or shift or evolve during the negotiation process? Explain. Did you use your backup strategy and or backup tactics? Why and how? So the first thing you want to answer is this first one. How did your strategy and tactics change or shift or evolve? They're going to shift and evolve. Even if you stay glued to them, they're going to go through different machinations, different iterations, different ways of working with them. And so what you want to do is explain that. And then if you did move on to your backup strategy or backup tactics, you build this in here as well. So he begins, yes, my strategy changed. Goes on to explain how. As much as I tried to stick to my original strategy because I believe this will generate a better agreement for the both of us, I realized that I was using integrated bargaining, but my opponent was still more focused on his own issues and interests without consideration to mine. By using my backup strategy, which is the post-settlement settlements, I proposed to divide the contract, and he goes on to explain how he did it. And that was it. So it was mostly around his backup strategy that he shifted. And it would have been good for him to include something about a backup tactic, because typically when we shift our strategies, our tactics change as well. But more or less, he's on track here. He happened to include a couple of lines of extra data around what he was working on here, but that may not be relevant for you. So that's just what he decided to do. So that's it for this question. Let's have a look now at question 4, which starts on the next page. Now we see here that question 4 is divided into 4 parts. You saw that in the template. So we're going to walk through briefly what each of the questions is asking for and show you a bit about what this person did. So the first one is, why did you achieve the settlement that you did? As I said in the template, that's not, some general question about, well, I really wanted to get this deal done or whatever it is. We're really looking for a high-level, big picture view of key behaviors and actions. So he starts by saying, my opponent and I achieved our settlement by doing integrated bargaining. That's kind of a throwaway sentence, but at least it sets it up. It actually should be integrative negotiation because bargaining is really used with the word distributive. Although there were some issues and misunderstandings during the negotiation process, we still managed to come up with the deal that is beneficial for the both of us. Even if our final settlement was very different from our respective target offers, we met halfway in all aspects of the negotiation. He provides a lot more detail, and that's been replaced by symbols here because there can be a tendency to want to borrow language a bit too much, and some students have gotten into some difficulty for plagiarism. So keep in mind that we're looking for a couple of good paragraphs here, okay, to really round this out. Do your best to focus on specific behaviors and actions for this one. Scrolling down, what was it you were experiencing, thinking about, feeling, concerned about, etc. at key times? And in blue it says, be clear about the important moments and explain what you were going through. Here, as an example, he says, during the negotiation, I was agitated because Sam was delivering lines that left no room for further collaborative negotiation. This is really zeroing in on something he was experiencing probably more than once. He said, I felt like I was getting the short end of the stick, so he wasn't getting a fair deal from him because of his approach. And since we were running out of time, I was worried that we would not be able to come up with a final agreement. This is a great way of describing his own experience of this. Remember, do not copy these sentences and try to turn them to your own world. Use your own language. I don't want you getting caught for plagiarism. Because I saw that even up to this point, we still had different points of view, and I was willing to be more creative, and so on. So he explains it here. Don't repeat. So don't repeat yourself. Make sure you answer each question on its own merit. There will be some overlap, but we'll deal with that separately. Next question. What were the 3 key turning points in what you were doing that led to this result? So every negotiation has turning points, things where they shift. It might happen right away, might happen later. What were the 3? We want 3 separate paragraphs with a line space in between describing what they were. So one of them that he describes is the first key turning point of our negotiation was our willingness to be transparent with all the information. So this happened up front. Maybe he went into it feeling more agitated or afraid, and then they realized that his opponent was willing to be open. First, we informed each other of our issues and interests, including which ones are important to us. We also discuss additional information, like lack of infrastructure and so on. And he says, I think that cemented our accountability to each other because we knew that from that point onwards, we cannot lie and invent situations. So that's one turning point. And sometimes there's a turning point, like I said, right at the beginning, and then look for two more. And you'll find that there's a relationship at some points with the previous question. There don't have to be exact alignments between these two, but you'll probably see some overlap. Going on to the next page. Here we have the third paragraph from that question that breaks here. And then we come to the last part of this. What patterns of behavior did you notice that occurred between you and your opponent? And these are behaviors that you seem to get into together, not a list of things you did, but specific patterns between both parties. This is not your own patterns on your own by yourself. But how did you get tangled up? Did both of you get stuck, somebody highballing, the other person lowballing, you kept going back and forth like that and nothing really happened? Did you openly collaborate in ways and talk about how those collaborations took place in some kind of a pattern? So we're probably going to have two paragraphs here. And we can see where he starts. The most prominent pattern of behavior that I noticed between me and my opponent was that we were both trying to be companionable. He means agreeable. Considering that we are friends, we had mutual trust, so even though we had misunderstandings with some terms on the case, we still managed to work collaboratively. So that's one pattern. Even though we had some frustrations, one of the patterns he noticed was this pattern of collaboration and trying to be amenable to each other. Then we have another paragraph that's been symboled out, but this provides more patterns. And you want to make sure you explain them. Don't just shotgun them. Explain each one. And as we shift down a bit, we see the last question. And this is very important. This is where you see yourself improving, where you want to focus your energy for your next negotiation. So the question asks, as we said in the template, what would you do differently or more of next time? Explain each behavior or element you want to change clearly and specifically. Remember, read the blue. It says need 3 specific behaviors or actions you want to do differently or better. Each one in its own paragraph. So we have each one here in its own section with a clear explanation in 3 to 4 sentences of what it is, how you plan to make it happen, and its benefit to you as a negotiator. So let's read one of them. One thing that I learned from this negotiation is that I should be more proactive in calling out my opponent if he or she is playing hardball or trying to undermine me. And brackets we have here, name it, which means call it and say, you're doing this thing. I think that in this case, we would have saved more time and energy if I was honest with Nitish about what I was thinking, specifically on how he was less collaborative during the first part of our negotiation, even though we agreed to fully integrative negotiation. So what he wants to do for one of his actions is focus on calling out my opponent. This is the part we were talking about before. And saying to the opponent, this is supposed to be an integrative situation. You're playing hardball. I'd like us to really focus on being more collaborative. Something like that, that avoids wasting time playing this kind of unconscious game where one person's trying to do one thing and the other person may be seemingly trying to undermine you, this kind of thing. So all he has here is 3 sentences basically, and that's all you need for each one. And he goes on to explain a second one and a third one on the following page. I'll just show you what that looks like. So scroll up here, you see he's got another one here, and I'll shift over and show you the last page. Here he says, I want to improve my ability to analyze all possible options that my opponent is communicating so I can be more calm during the actual negotiation. What he's saying here is, I want to be able to handle all the things my opponent's saying at me and slow things down and really analyze and make good decisions. And then it goes on to explain basically what the benefit is and how he's going to do it. And that's what we want to see. All the best with your negotiation assignments.